My name is Jason Hasty. I'm the athletic specialist for the Hargett Rare Book and Manuscript Library. I'm here with Coach Vince Dooley in his home. Today is May 31st, 2017, and this is the second in a series of oral history interviews we'll be doing with Coach Dooley about his life and career. So thank you again, Coach. Our first interview, we talked a little bit about your early life and how you came to Georgia. And in this interview, I'd like to start talking about your first year on the job and the first years you had here and some of the success you had. So how did you actually come about getting the job here at Georgia? How did you find out that you got the job? What were your thoughts?
Well, when I look back on it, it's really amazing because I think Georgia people were welcoming a change, and that Joe Lees, the athletic director, was my basketball coach at Auburn. We scouted together for 5 years, and he knew me and I knew him. But my plan really was not to come to Georgia, and I don't think he planned really to hire me. But as it turned out, he wanted me to come, but it would be hard for him to recommend a young, very young assistant coach who was a freshman coach at Auburn at a rival school. That's not good qualifications, and I certainly wouldn't have hired myself under the similar situation. But nevertheless, I think what put him over the hump, he was wrestling with it, was that Frank Broyles at Arkansas, where I had applied, my plan was to leave Auburn and serve under Frank Broyles at Arkansas or Del Royal at Texas. And then if Auburn, when Coach Jordan retired, they might ask me to come back. But Frank Broyles called looking for me because he wanted to hire me as the backfield coach. And I think that triggered Coach Eves to go ahead and offer me the job. So the Georgia people got excited when they hired him. He said he was going to do a national search. And then I kid when I said the Georgia people were very excited when they announced the new coach is Vince. Mm-hmm. They were thinking Vince Lombardi, not me. And said, who in the heck is Vince Dooley? And as I mentioned, my credentials, 31 years old, freshman coach at a rival school, of which, as an administrator, which I was for 25 years, there's no way I would have hired myself. But nevertheless, I got the job. He called me. I was in Memphis recruiting for Auburn. He offered me the job, and I said, well, give me 5 minutes. And I called Barbara, and she said, well, I'll never complain again about you being gone. Yeah, that's all. That's very exciting. She didn't keep that promise, I might add. But nevertheless, I called Coach Eves back. I said, look, if you're willing to stick your neck out for me, I'm coming. And I did, and I remember flying in. I flew in from Atlanta. Coach Dan McGill picked me up and actually said, get down. We're driving through town. Well, I thought to myself, well, I could walk down the middle of the street and nobody would know who I was. So he took me to the Holiday Inn, quickly put me in a room, gave me a sandwich and said, just stay there and I'll call and let you know. And he called, and I went and met the athletic board where they officially announced that I was the new head coach. So it was kind of an interesting experience, particularly now as I look back on it.
Because you were so young and so inexperienced.
Well, again, I was 31 years old, freshman coach, rival school. As an administrator, there's no way I would have hired myself under those conditions. But he really stuck his neck out. But he did know me, and so he was willing, I guess, to take that chance.
Did the Georgia people accept you right away, or was there a time where they had to get to know you as someone other than coming from Auburn?
Well, I always kid and say that as I look back on it now, other than Coach Eves, Barbara, and myself, we were the only ones that thought it was a good hire. I don't see how anybody could have thought that that's a good hire. But the loyal, really loyal people would actually, would rally behind the coach, whoever. But there was a lot of skeptics, and rightfully so, should be. Again, with the qualifications, no Georgia background at all. So there was a lot of skepticism, but I was young. It's one of the beauties of youth. You don't know any different. All you know is you got an opportunity, and you need to go about doing your job, establishing credibility, and the way you do that is to produce a winning football team. And fortunately, we were able to do that. And then, fortunately, I was able to survive crises, because you survive a series of crises in coaching. And I did that over a period of 25 years, and proud of the fact that we're still in Athens after all those years.
Well, you mentioned building a winning team and having success. You did have success early. You took us to the Sun Bowl in '64, first bowl game we'd been to in quite a few years. What was that season like? Did you think you'd have that kind of success right away, or did you think it would take more time to turn around the program?
I don't think we thought so much in terms of the long range. We just kind of addressed the year and addressed the games from game to game. But the first thing we addressed was a coaching staff. I had to hire a coaching staff. And fortunately, I ended up with a very good staff. Two key people was Irk Russell and my brother, Bill. Irk is a defensive coordinator. My brother, Billy, who was at Mississippi State, and he was, I think, the best offensive line coach in the country. But I had to wrestle with, here's my brother, what problems will that solve? But I kept coming back to the fact that I'm going to hire the best coach, regardless of whether he's my brother or not. So I hired him, and then I hired Irk, and they were key. And then we got a great blend of Georgia people and people that I knew at Auburn. And they were really a committed, unified staff. And we spent many, many hours trying to get on the same page with terminology and everything. I would say that we met at least 6 hours a day on these old steel chairs we were sitting in without any cushions. And when we first came, because frugality is important, because our budget, I think, that first year was not even $2 million. And when you think about a budget today of almost $30 million,
sure,
ours was $2 million.
And that was for the entire athletic department.
Well, yeah,
okay,
not just football, but the entire athletic department. And then I met some key people early on, which was really important. I talked about certain people that are loyal, and I can still remember Bill Hartman being one. He was the chairman of the Georgia Student Education Fund, as it was called in those days, and he was there to meet me, and during those early times when Barbara came and it snowed in Athens and ice, we were locked into the Holiday Inn. Our daughter Deanna was 2 years old. Our son Daniel was 6 months old, and he was crying. And Barbara was pregnant with Denise, and the electricity went out, and all of her friends, our friends, were down in Miami. Auburn went to the Orange Bowl. So she's wondering, what place did you bring me? But Bill Hartman was there to help it in those early days. And he was a good friend, and he was one that was loyal to whoever the coach was. The other one was Dan McGill, who was loyal to whoever the coach was. He was an old Marine. We were fellow Marines, and whoever the CEO is, or the commanding officer, that's who you rally behind. And Dan McGill did. So those two were very special to me, and really helped me early on. I listened to them. I was anytime that I had a question, they would give me some help on the Georgia background, the history, the tradition of Georgia, because I had no idea. I wanted to learn everything I could about Georgia. If I was going to be the coach, I wanted to learn the history and the tradition. And then young Loren Smith, who I say young because he was like 22 or 23 at the time, after the press conference that day, and I went back to my room and I had a stack of phone calls 3 inches thick. I had a knock on the door, and there was Loren at age 23, who was covering for the Athens Banner-Herald. He wanted to do a special story on me. Well, Loren has, of course, moved into that position as the loyal bulldog because Bill Hartman and Dan McGill, who was both of them so great for Georgia, have passed on, and Loren has taken their place in a lot of ways. And Loren learned a lot from them as well. So those people were extremely helpful to me. And I'll mention one other in learning about Georgia is Dean Tate. Dean Tate, everybody that went to Georgia when Dean Tate was here had some kind of encounter with Dean Tate one way or the other. But nevertheless, nobody loved Georgia or was more devoted or knew more about Georgia than Dean Tate. So one time we both were going to a Bulldog Club meeting in Dalton. And so I was going to drive, and I picked him up. I really wanted to be with him because I could learn about Georgia. Well, he got in the car, and we started driving, and he started talking about the University of Georgia. He didn't stop talking until we got to Dalton. Then he spoke. We got in the car and started driving back, and he didn't stop talking about Georgia until we got to Athens. So I learned more in that one night from any one individual the whole time I was in Athens. So all of that is just background, how important it was for me. If I was going to be the Georgia football coach, I wanted to learn about Georgia. I had always had an interest in history and still do. And it was very early on that I thought it was important to do that. So I had this background as I hired this staff as we started into the first football season.
In that first season, you were taking over a group of men or group of players who had really gone through some tough times in previous years. Being so young, was it difficult for you to come in and command the respect of them immediately, or did you have to work to find that? Or what was the situation like for you and your staff coming in to take over this group that had not had a lot of success and were probably hungry for that?
Well, the group was really hungry. The senior group was good. They had gone through a tough time. In fact, there were 3 straight losing seasons, and overall of the previous 9 seasons, there were 7 losing seasons. So this group that had gone through 3 straight losing seasons, three straight losses to Georgia Tech, the rival, they wanted to win, and I felt like that they were aggressive. They would hit you, which is it's a Spartan game, and but they weren't unified, and we had to be unified as a staff, and we had to be demanding, and discipline I thought was extremely important, and we were very strong about going to class. So those things, if they did not come to meetings on time, if they missed class or whatever it may be, we had what we call sunrise service. And that meant you got up really early in the morning and did some extra work, extra conditioning work. And our coaches were right there with them. So we had a young staff. And I think that gradually the players really believed in our coaches. And we were all about coaching, all about unifying a group, and because we really had a good group of dedicated players. And even though we got our tails kicked really bad in the first game, It was the first game we played Alabama. They were national champions. Bear Bryant was the coach, and Joe Namath was the quarterback. But we went over and played well and learned a lot about our team early on. It's one good thing about playing really a good team. You learn what your problems are and how to address them. And I did make some changes. I took Coach Russell, who was the end coach, and I made him the defensive line coach. Took Jim Pyrbin, who was the line coach, and he was better suited as an end coach. So I moved him to the defensive end. And so we made some changes, and we took players and got them in a better position. Joel Darden, as an example, was a linebacker. He was such an aggressive, good player that he was much better down. So we took him from the linebacking position and moved him down. So we made some changes because we found out early on what our problems were. And we really got better and better and better. And by the end of the season, we were a pretty daggone good football team and went to a bowl game. It was the Sun Bowl. And you would have thought that we had gone to the Sugar Bowl or some major bowl at the time. Everybody was happy. And we were able to beat Georgia Tech for the first time. We beat Florida and Georgia had lost 10 out of 12 to Florida. So we had some key wins in the ball game. And I think more than anything, the fans really related to this football team, because I used to tell our team, I said, maybe the fans don't know quite as much about football as they think they know. But one thing they can tell is if a team is really trying, if a team is laying it out on every play. And they saw that in this team. Classic example, we were playing Kentucky. And Kentucky takes the opening kickoff and drives 65, 70 yards in 8, 10 plays and score. Our defense comes off the field. The stands give them a standing ovation. We played Florida State and went down to the wire with them, and they were really good at the time. And we lost right at the end. Well, people came out on the fans came out and started hugging the players and the coaches. So I'm thinking, man, this is a great place to coach. They like you even when you don't win. Of course, that didn't last very long. But nevertheless, there's an indication of how the fans responded to this football team, because they really saw a bunch of guys really laying it on the line for old Georgia, and they appreciated that.
How did you build on that success of your first season? Because you ended up in 65, you had a good year until injuries took a toll on the team toward the end of the season, and then 66, we ended up being our co-champions of the SEC with Alabama. So you had success quickly. Did you take that success in 64 and build on it, or were the elements there? How did you come about having that success so early on?
Well, we did build on the 64 team. I mean, we maintained that aggressiveness, that unity, and the discipline. But what we lacked was reserve strength, because Georgia went 2 years without having good recruiting years. We had a terrific freshman team, and that was Bill Stanfield and Jake Scott and Billy Payne, and I could go on because it was the best class we've had up until the 1980 class. But they were freshmen, and they were not eligible. If we had had that team, if they had been eligible in 65, then we could have had some reserve strength. We had a terrific first team, but we had very poor reserves because it went 2 years without good recruiting. All of our good reserve players were on the freshman team. So we had a great start. We beat Alabama, upset Alabama, that were national champions again. That's the only game they lost that year.
The flea flicker play, the famous
beat them on what we called a flea flicker. Right at the end, it was a pass from Kirby Moore to Pat Hodgson to Bob Taylor, But we had to go for 2, so we beat them 18-17. We go up to Michigan, and Michigan had been to the Rose Bowl and Big Ten champions the year before, and we beat them in Ann Arbor. And there was an incredible amount of excitement here in Athens when we came back. So we got off to a great start, and then we started losing players. We lost Bob Taylor, who got his leg broken against Florida State. We lost Doug McFalls, who broke his jaw, and Joe Burson got hurt. These were all good first-team players, but we had no reserves. The real reserves are on the freshman team. So we lost 2 or 3 in the middle, but came back, got them back in the last game, and beat Georgia Tech again. So we were a 6-4 team. We didn't go to a bowl game because back in those days, you had to do better than 6-4 to go to a bowl game. But we ended up, and it kind of set the stage for the next year when that freshman team became eligible. And we had one solid, good football team in '66.
And speaking of '66, you were 1 point away, at 1 point lost to Miami away from an undefeated season. Walk us through that season. How did that, did you have great expectations for that season? Did you think it was going to be a great year? Were you anticipating an SEC championship type of season that quickly? And what were the players thinking? Did they think that they had a good, solid team going into that year?
We thought again with the freshmen coming up, and that was again the best class we ever had. And I wasn't sure how mature they would be that early because they were sophomores back then. That's pretty young when you're just a sophomore, when you're playing for the first time on the varsity. But they were a committed bunch and a solid bunch. We did lose to Miami, that was picked before the season as national champions. They had a rough start, but we did play well down in Miami. It was hot, and they beat us by 1 point. But we learned from that ball game and came back and won out the rest of the year. We were undefeated from that point on, including the Cotton Bowl where we went. So we were really a good, solid overall team. And by overall, I mean that we were good in all phases of the game. We were solid offensively. We could play defense. We were good in the kicking game. And we had some really terrific players. For instance, on defense, we had Bill Stanfield and we had George Patton. George Patton was a quarterback out of high school that when we got here, we just started moving people around. And George had a great way about him, so we moved him to defensive tackle. He became an All-American defensive tackle as quarterback. In fact, we had 7 quarterbacks, ex-quarterbacks in high school that made up our defensive team early on. So we had Patton on one side and Stanfield on the other. And that was a good duo of pass rushers from those 2 guys, the best that we had up until we had Freddie Gilbert and Jimmy Payne in the 80s. So when you have people coming off the corner rushing the passer, you got a pretty daggone good defense. And we had a good defense, and we had solid running on offense, good players. Ronnie Jenkins was one as an example that I call him my old wood chopper from down in South Georgia, and just a great player. And Kirby Moore was our quarterback, had great speed. We had good speed. Ken Lawrence, he had world-class speed, so we had speed too. So we were good, and it was the first championship, and it was very, very special.
How, as a coach, do you take a team that suffers a close loss and get them back going in the right direction and not let that loss sink the rest of the season?
Yeah. Well, I think the main thing is that it wasn't all the fault of the players. I mean, we had players that really laid it on the line. So in those losses, we took responsibility for it as ourselves, as coaches. Me first as a head coach. I mean, how can we, if this team is trying and they lay it on the line, we got to help them. And we help them by learning from our defeat as to how we can better have a football team. And I think that attitude played well with the players. They were not feeling like it was all their fault. I mean, it was our fault because we're coaches. It's my fault as a head coach. We took that responsibility, learned, made the adjustments as we had done earlier on the '64 team, and we learned from the defeat. And you can learn a heck of a lot more sometimes by losing, so long as you don't lose too much. But an occasional loss will teach you a lot of things about your football team and about your coaching decisions. And I think we all learned from that loss.
Now, going ahead a little bit to 1968, again, you had a great team that year. Some of those sophomores had grown up, but there were a couple of you ended up having a couple of ties. One of which was a little bit probably difficult to overcome. The tie against Tennessee. You had a situation where pass was ruled complete later on, maybe seeing that it was not complete. How do you challenge a team to overcome that? Was that a difficult situation to overcome?
Well, the tie at Tennessee was a downer. But again, if you're going to lose, it's better to lose early. And it was like a loss to us. The team took it as a loss. And there's no question that Tennessee scored on a 4th down, 4th and 20, and they threw the ball down the middle, hit the receiver right in the chest, but we didn't know it at the time. And before they had instant replay, the ball hit the turf and bounced straight up, and the receiver got it, so they called it a touchdown. And then they went for 2 and made it to ties. But again, I think we learned from the loss early on, or in this case, a tie. It was like, I always say that there are 3 different kind of ties. Is the one in which you're very fortunate to have tied, which we did later on against Houston, as an example. Then you had the bad tie, where you feel like you really should have won the game, and Tennessee was one. And then the other one is just one of those ties that somebody explained is like kissing your sister, and that may be the case. But it was a bad tie, and we learned from it, and went on, and again had a championship year. The big problem with it, we had a great senior group, was who was going to be our quarterback. And it just so happened that Mike Cabin, who was a very mature individual. I think his daddy had redshirted him even in high school. And so Mike related well to the players, to the senior players. And the senior players respected Mike. And because of that, and he was such a good player with good experience, even though he was young, that he was able to provide great leadership for this group of seniors that we had. And consequently, it all fell into place, and we won another championship. And so that was 2 out of 3 with that freshman class, and we could have won it even in '67.
So obviously, at this point, you're having success. Do you feel more comfortable in Georgia? And also, what's your relationship like with Joel Eves at this time? Does he feel like he made a successful hire, or?
Well, yeah, we worked closely together. In fact, we had, and it's important for an athletic director and a head football coach, and we had offices side by side, and we had a door that opened between those offices, and we shared the same secretary, so we were pretty close. Coach Eves was he was a great administrator, and wonderful person, good, solid coach, and I learned a lot from him. But of course, we had differences. But we would voice those differences in an office between the two of us, and then there would be a resolution. He either said, well, this is the way we're going to do it, or he would say, I understand, and we'll do it your way. So we had a good relationship in that respect, and I think there was a lot of mutual respect between the two of us. And when you have that within your department, because you've got, it's extremely important to be close, because there's so much interest in a team, and there's so many opinions in a team from throughout the state. But if you're a unified staff that can stay close together when things are going tough, then you've got a chance to be able to survive crises, which we did, and be able to be harmonious and get along good. So we did.
Now, one of the constants of your staff from the first year in '64 all the way through 1980 was Irk Russell. Was it a benefit for you as a head coach to have that kind of a long-serving assistant coach? And did that help you manage the team over the long term?
Yeah, Irk was a tremendous help to me because I was pretty young. Irk was had been in the service and was older and had had high school coaching experience. And so he was a tremendous compliment to me as a coach early on as I was feeling my way. And because of that, it was, I think, very, very beneficial. And we got along good together because I felt like it was important that he get the credit that he deserved. He even had a radio show. A lot of head coaches would not have allowed their assistant coaches to have a radio show and to be that expressive. So I didn't mind my staff, and in this case, Irk, or when my brother Bill was with me, for them to be more expressive. And so in that respect, I think Irk knew that I respected him, and I think he respected me because of it. So we were together 17 years, and we had a lot of great times. We had some times that were not so good, but we had a lot of great times, and we were very close.
Now, through the 1960s, obviously, this is a time of great social change in the United States. How did that affect your team? Was that something that you had to deal with in changing attitudes of your players? Were they concerned about, certainly in the late 60s, early 70s, about the Vietnam War, maybe getting drafted if they lost their student status? How did that affect your program or how you managed that program?
Well, we had
just the changes outside of that.
I think we felt it more in the early 70s than we did in the 60s. After the two championship years, we had a kind of a down situation. And it was important in 1971 that we get back to where we were. And we had these young sophomores, Jimmy Poulos and Andy Johnson, and a bunch of other players that really wanted to play. And so in '71, we came back and we were 11-1. We only lost one game, and ended up in the top 5 or 6 in the country. And it was important to have that because after having 2 championship teams, and we had 2 very mediocre. And when you set the bar that high, mediocrity is not acceptable. And it certainly wasn't acceptable to us. So we came back in '71 and had a great year, which really helped us. And then we did go into that period of early 70s of what you're talking about. There was a lot of social issues going on, the Vietnam War, as you mentioned, and the questioning of authority. And we could feel it. We had some players that participated in that outwardly, but when it came to criticizing the football team, they were very unified. It's kind of like, you know, my wife Barbara could give me hell, but she didn't want anybody else to be giving me hell. Well, I think that a lot of these players were the same way. They agreed with what they felt like was social issues outside, and they were involved in it. But when it came to the football team, they were very close and very protective and didn't want people to be criticizing that. So fortunately, that's the way they handled the social issues.
Did that change your approach to the players though? Did you find that you needed to deal with them differently, or were you able to continue on as you had started with really tough discipline and very unified staff? Or was that something that you were able to carry on through those kind of more turbulent years?
No, I think that you learn in dealing with people. You don't change your principles of discipline or running a football team or your expectations or what you demand. But I guess you could be a little more understanding. Maybe you can learn how to say no in a nicer way. And I think that I was able to do that. I didn't change what I believed in, but I did change my relationship with the players. And I got better, and I think I grew from that experience. But again, I didn't change my principles or what I believed in, just how to better handle the football players, which I think I did as time went on.
Now, of course, one of the major changes during this era is the integration of the SEC. What was your perspective as a coach on admitting African American players onto the team? Was that something that, because we're first players, we had two. The first was a walk-on named James Hurley. Then John King had come on board a little later on. And then we signed a group of 5 African American players. As a coach, what was your perspective on integration? Did you feel that this was something, obviously other teams were doing it, other teams in the SEC were doing it. Was this something that you were looking forward to? How did you handle this?
Well, Kentucky was the first to sign a black player, an integration, which I guess fits in because it was a border state from that standpoint. And you knew historically that it was coming, socially it was coming. And so you're right, James Hurley was the first walk-on. Being the first walk-on, it took a lot on his part to be out there. I remember that I guess he got introduced by some of the others to see just how he was going to handle this. So we had what we call the circle butt drill. And that's where a player would jump in the middle and point to somebody, and then they would butt heads, so to speak. And Hurley handled that. He got tested pretty strongly, but he handled it so well. And so I was really excited about having Hurley. I loved his attitude, the way he handled himself. And so I thought he might be the first scholarship black player that we had. But as it turned out, before I knew it, he'd already gone to Vanderbilt and accepted a scholarship at Vanderbilt, so I was very disappointed in that. But then the next year, we signed 5 blacks. And it just so happened that 3 of them were from Athens. And they were a little concerned. They were not so sure. I think we had good support from the blacks in the community. They wanted to see some of the young blacks from Athens play. But some of those fellows had had a bad experience in high school because there was the integration in high school between Clark Central and old Athens High School is what it was at one time. So that was integrated with the black school, which was then named Clark Central. Mm-hmm. So there were some issues there that had to be addressed. And so those players lived through that integration in high school in Athens. And again, they were not so sure. Horace King is an example, who's a great player and a great person. He wasn't so sure. And then Richard Appleby, the same way. And then we had two other players, one from Albany, Georgia, named Larry West, who had no reservations at all about coming. I remember talking to Larry and assuring him that I would treat him just like I treat my own son. And he said, "Coach, you don't have to worry about me. You know, I know you'll treat me right." As opposed to Horace, as an example, that wasn't so sure. Then we had Chuck Kennebrew from Rome, Georgia, who also was one that was confident. He was confident that he was going to make it, but he again had some reservations too. So anyway, those five were the first ones that came, and it was the beginning of integration. And we had some issues along the way.
Yeah, I was going to ask, how did the team respond to this? Some of them, of course, had gone through integration in high school, but were they reluctant, were they reticent, or was it just simply, these are good players and we'll accept them as good football players on
Well,
the team?
the integration, I think, so much in the South can be attributed to football. And it starts in high school. And fortunately, what helped us at the college level is that, for the most part, these players all had been integrated in high school. And they have been accepted there because the great thing about football, it doesn't make any difference what your background is economically, what your ethnic background is. If you perform on the football field, you'll be accepted. And so they were so much accepted in high school that just made integration in college so much easier. So that was a big factor with us of making the integration part of it smooth. Now, realistically, most of the problems are a few people at the extreme of both ends. You get the greatest majority that seem to get along very well together, but it's always somebody at the far end that causes some problems. So we had some issues. At one time, we had some things that were going on at the dorm as to who was doing what. You know, you'd have one that would accuse somebody else. A black player would be accusing a white player, or vice versa. So I remember that we got in a team meeting, and I got all the coaches outside, and I just got with the team, and I said, "Now look, we've got to be a team first, and there's some issues that are going on. Now, I want to know if you've got a problem with anybody in here, then you express it, because we're going to keep it here." So one person stands up and says, "So-and-so made some remark," and then that person responded and said, "Well, that's not the case, because I really didn't say that." And so once they started going back and forth at each other, talking and finding out that it was not as bad as they had perceived it to be, then I thought we had a much better understanding and had a kind of a soul-searching experience that I think really helped our football team. That was the only, I'd say, crises we had, was at that moment, and it seemed to be solved by the fact that we got everybody in a room together. Everybody accused each other of things that really wasn't as bad as it was perceived and what they had talked about, and had a better understanding of each other as people than they did before we started that meeting.
Now, obviously, you'd been in the Marine Corps and it was integrated. Did you take some of the lessons from commanding an integrated unit in the Marine Corps and apply that to coaching as well?
Well, I did when I coached in the Marine Corps at Parris Island. Before I started coaching in college, the team was integrated, so it was a big help to me myself. But I drew so much from the Marine Corps throughout my career as a coach, because leadership was extremely important, discipline was extremely important, and those lessons that I had learned as a Marine officer was a tremendous help to me in my coaching throughout my career.
Now look at, you said you had a couple of down years or mediocre years in the late 60s, but you were able to rebound by 71 and have a great season where you just lost to Auburn that one game. How did you rebound from that? How do you take a program that has set the bar high, then slid down a little bit, and bring it back up?
Well, I think you just have to evaluate yourself during the course of the year, and then at the end of the year, and then to make what adjustments you need to make. I've described coaching as surviving a series of crises, and those crises will either be on the football field or off the football field, and we had both. The ones that are on the football field that you're referring to, it might be that we just didn't do as good a job, or we needed to make some changes, and we would discuss it during the off season and make those changes, and the players would respond, and we would have another year that kept us going. I mentioned 71 as an example, but we also won the championship in 1976. And when you win a championship, then that kind of gets you a couple of more years until you go through another crisis. And so it's surviving a series of crises and being able to address what the problems are. And it could be problems in recruiting, it could be problems in coaching. Are we doing the best possible coaching job? Are we getting the players in the right position? It could be a number of things, and often it is, in making those corrections.
Now, one of the changes that you made, and kind of going back to 1968, we played Houston and tied them. They ran the veer offense under their coach Bill Yeomans, and eventually you adapted that kind of offense. Is that something that you looked at them and said, okay, this is something that's successful for them and we're going to try to use it as well? Or did you look to your peers who were coaching for new ideas or changes that you might want to make, or new innovations, things that you wanted to do with our program? What are some of the examples maybe of that?
Well, I think the 71 team was an example. When we got Poulos and we got Andy Johnson at quarterback, we went to an I formation, option off the I, that was suitable to those two guys. And it so happened, and that's a particularly interesting year, because my brother and I, you're constantly talking with coaches during the off season about your situation. So my brother and I decided we both were going to run that offense. It was the I with the option off of it, with the lead, and we talked every week about how we did in the previous game, and then at the end of the season, we ended up playing each other in the Gator Bowl. We had no idea that we were going to play each other, and we knew everything about each other because we'd been talking about it all year long. So it became a real defensive struggle. I mean, it was kind of a boring game, as though it ended up 7-3. But the main reason is that we both had the same offense. So there's just one example of making an adjustment. In 76, we did start running the veer. We had started it in 74, and we ran it a little bit different than what Houston ran. But the veer was ideally suited for our quarterback, Ray Goff, and Matt Robinson. And we had two quarterbacks that we won a championship using two quarterbacks, which normally you're not supposed to do. But we had a first string quarterback, and that was Ray Goff. He had won the job. And then Matt, who had played the year before, got beat out. But we still used him because he was a daggone good football player. And we could not have won the championship without using two quarterbacks. And the offense was very suitable to us. We had a great offensive line of scrimmage. So the Veer offense was extremely helpful to us in '76 in winning the championship that year.
Now, you had two quarterbacks in '76, Matt Robinson and Ray Goff. They both had different strengths, Ray Goff being a great running quarterback. How do you manage a situation like that? How do you manage a situation where you have two quarterbacks, each with their own strengths? How do you, as a coach and as a staff, approach that situation and make it work? Certainly to the point where you can win a championship with that.
Well, I think it's important that one is a first-string quarterback and the other is a second. You can't have a controversy. You got to make a decision who's going to be your starter, but the other quarterback knows that he's going to play. As an example, in the Alabama game, which was a big win for us in that championship year, Matt Robinson scored a touchdown himself and passed for a touchdown. And then Ray Goff took the team 70 yards on a drive that was the other touchdown that won. So there's an example of both quarterbacks performing in a critical ball game and doing extremely well that helped us to win the game, and probably could not have won it with just one quarterback. But again, Ray Goff was the starter and Matt was number two because he got hurt and was beat out by Ray, and he couldn't get his job back because he had hurt his knee prior to the opening season, and Ray Goff had done so well you couldn't make a change. So it worked, and that's why it worked.
Now in '76, you have one of your most legendary plays of your career against Vanderbilt, the shoestring play. Ray Goff walks up the line, flips the ball to the running back, he runs, pretends he's tying his shoe, flips the ball to the running back, and runs in for a score. How do you put in or conceive of or put in plays like that, and how do you determine when it's appropriate to run a play like that or the flea flicker that beat Alabama in '65?
Well, you always have special plays. I always had some reluctance about the shoestring play, but I went with one of my staff members who convinced me that Vanderbilt was the ideal person to run that against, and it was, and it worked well. But it came back to haunt us a little bit later on in the Cotton Bowl. But you've always got 3 or 4 plays that you work on specially, and it's a question of timing as to when to use it. Case in point would be the Florida game in 1975, because we had an end-around pass. Richard Appleby was a heck of a good athlete that could throw the ball a mile, and he could also run. And we ran the end around several times during the course of the year and several times in that Florida game, but we also had to pass off of it. And it was a question of timing as when to use it. And so Richard Appleby took the handoff, and Gene Washington went down and slowed the block, and then went past the cornerback, and then Richard threw it, a long touchdown pass. And I remember afterwards they were interviewing Richard, and he said, "Well, I guess I just rose to the occasion." And I mentioned Appleby, and then King had a great year. And I also want to mention Clarence Pope. Clarence was right there with them, and Clarence ended up being a minister here in Athens, and also retired from the fire department. It was a great person. So we had good people out of that first 3 blacks out of Athens that we signed.
Well, Coach, we have about 5 minutes left, so we'll start wrapping it up. Is there anything you'd like to add about what we've talked about already, or anything else you'd like to add?
No, I think right now we probably ought to wrap it up.